If you've been a follower of mine for a while, you might remember Jethro Bodine. If you're new here, well, he's a guy who's a very southern kind of guy. He's a Christian, of course. And we had a little back and forth between our videos, and I found the exchange very unsatisfying ultimately because he's too self-aware. I mean, props to him for having some self-awareness. A lot of the people I respond to, Big Nick, have none whatsoever and think way too highly of themselves. Jethro Bodine, at the very least, currently, is a real person. Whether that remains true if he becomes a big YouTuber with hundreds of thousands of followers remains to be seen, but for now, I think of Jethro Bodine as a very self-aware person, and really probably not a bad guy. We just disagree on a whole lot of things. So when I made a video a couple months ago called I Am an Alcoholic, I was unsurprised to see him respond to it. And the response was in some ways very kind indeed, and I would like to sincerely thank Jethro Bodine for the kinder parts of his response, but I also feel like he dropped the ball in some major ways, and I don't think this is really a problem of his necessarily. I think it's just that the Jesus blinders kick in sometimes with people, and they don't realize that maybe they're not coming off exactly the way they want to come off. So we're going to watch this video Jethro Bodine did about my video about alcoholism and see what he has to say, respond to him, and hope he doesn't respond because, Jesus Christ, I would like this saga to be over with. I had no idea when posting that video 2 months ago I was going to be talking about alcoholism so much. And now that I'm almost a month sober, everybody congratulate me, that's awesome, I know. I'm really sick of talking about it because, like, you know, it's boring. It's boring now. I don't drink anymore. It's boring. So let's watch this video and hope this is the end of it.
London Storm, this video is for you. I want you to know you've kept my day all upside down and backwards, and that is fantastic. Usually I get up and do my Bible studies and move on into things, but as of your last video about alcoholism, I was like, man, I'm taking this. I'm going to jump on this video first. I'm going to try to go home and post it as rapidly as I can because I would really like to just share with you. I just want to talk to you directly on this, but let me talk to the general audience for a second that might be listening in. If you are listening in and want to hear this whole scenario, you need to know that I made some videos a while back. London Storm took the video, chopped it up, and he called me Jethro, you know, because of the beard and my countryness, etc. And so I played off of that, went back, and I will say that London Storm was very cordial, and he responded back with, well, at least you rolled with the gimmick. But this is about deep things.
So now you've seen some Jethro. That's Jethro. That's a good explanation of our interactions to that point. And I have a couple things to say. The first thing is, I'm glad I was able to interrupt your Bible study. That's one positive benefit of that video I didn't expect. Another one is, in the next part, which I am going to cut out for time purposes, he does go into this thing about watch this video so it gets directly to their page and they see it and all that. And I just want to say, the joke's on you, Jethro. I am subscribed to your page, so I saw it the day it came out. And I did comment on it, I'm pretty sure, the day it came out. I was actually at a cafe, a Turkish cafe, when it came out. So I was sipping my Turkish coffee and having some delicious sandwich of some kind. And I was like, oh God, here we go. And it turned out to not be as bad as I was thinking it was going to be. And I commented, left a long one, and said I'd be commenting more on it. So here we are. And again, for time constraints, I'm going to cut out some of the things he says. I'm going to cut out the parts with myself, and let's proceed.
But London, again, this is for you. And I think it took some brass. I think it took some brass to do what you did the other day. And it's from that you're showing that you were really, truly getting in touch with reality. You got online and you said, hey, I'm an alcoholic. And anybody that's seen my videos, I've taken down about 200 videos, but one that I have not taken down was where I was confessing that I used to be a porn addict, a sex addict, and more.
This would be, of course, a fantastic point for a classless joke, but I'm not going to do that today because he revealed something about himself that's, of course, very intimate and no doubt hard to talk about. What I will say here is that I've heard plenty of stories of Christians who have looked at lewd materials and thought because they've done that, they are addicted to lewd materials, and sometimes that's not the case. Now, I don't know Jethro Bodine's habits in particular, and I think if there is a God, we can all be thankful for that at least. But he did reveal something intimate about himself, and I think he deserves some credit here, so let's give him some credit for that, and please do not make fun of him for that revelation.
And so as I was addicted to all of those things, it had control over my life. And to actually openly confess that, I know how difficult that is and how much of a train wreck that can cause. And to this day, about 20-something years later, I still suffer backlash from the evil that I was involved in then.
I just have a couple questions here. I want to know what is evil specifically that he's referring to. Was the evil the lewd material itself and the hopefully consensual acts between adults? Or was it the amount? Was it the quantity? Because, Christians have different views on this kind of stuff. I've been to all kinds of churches, and each one of them will tell you something completely different about what makes something evil or not. But I think evil, in any event, is a harsh term. I don't think my alcoholism was evil. I think it was mostly just really stupid and bad for me. And then I also have to question the backlash. Who is the backlash from, I wonder? Is it a person, or is it just your mind? Because I know when I think about alcoholism, my family didn't like it a whole lot because they're fundamentalist teetotalers. They don't drink at all, so they didn't like it, and that was where some backlash came from. But I've never really cared a whole lot about what they thought for a ton of reasons, and still don't, so that doesn't matter. But backlash can come from many different places. It can come from inside the mind, which is where mine mostly came from, because I realized I was putting myself at risk, and unnecessarily so. So I wonder if for Jethro it was something similar to that. Maybe it's his own mind that has tormented him about this for the past 20 years. But I guess we'll see, or maybe not.
And you got really personal. You said things like, I need therapy. Like, one time in my life I could have afforded it, but I can't now. And I really do need therapy. And then you actually went so far as to say, Christianity and religion, it helps some people. And that's really good. It builds community and it helps. And then you mentioned the other side of Christianity as well. You said that there are some that prey upon the vulnerable. Yeah, it's like wolves attracted to a bleeding out sheep. Yeah, this is easy target.
I think this is maybe where we've got our first little error in communication here, because I've always said that religion does help some people. That's pretty obvious. It clearly does. I mean, there are plenty of testimonies to that effect, and I imagine while a significant portion of them are fake, a significant portion of them are not fake. I imagine a lot of people are indeed helped by religion. That's not controversial. The next part is a little bit more so, because I wasn't just talking about the bad actors of religion. I wasn't just talking about the groups that prey on people specifically for money or what have you. I wasn't talking about that. I was talking more about the fact that there are a lot of people who just are not of the believing orientation, and yet who are told that the only way they can get better is by believing in some higher power, and that higher power, of course, they want to be God. Now, for me personally, I don't think there is such a thing as a higher power in any sense. I think the highest power that currently exists is the human mind because of all the things it can do. And there are a lot of people like me, and I have seen, as I said in that video, people who are just like me in the sense that they think the human mind is the highest power out there, and yet it's prey to all of these, malfunctions. And when people are involved in these groups that tell them there is only one way out, and that is religion, even if they don't believe in religion, they're still likely to, sort of take in that message in a very odd way, like that if they can't believe, that failing is entirely on them. And I know for a fact you would agree with me that putting religion on somebody who doesn't want it is wrong. But the fact is, most recovery groups in America do exactly that. And this isn't necessarily a wolves in sheep's clothing thing. It can be, but that's not the message I was trying to get at there.
Yes, if there is any kind of truth to Christianity, it is going to attract some very weak people to the outside of Christianity, and it's going to attack some people that can see the vulnerability that people have, and they're like, oh, I want to get in that, and I want to really screw some people over. I want to take advantage of things. So you have both. And so I've heard it stated like this a long time ago: don't judge a hospital by the patients, rather judge it by the doctors.
Whether something is true or false or good or bad, it is invariably going to attract people who are themselves good or bad, because the world is a complicated place. It's always been one, and it always will be one. There will be good actors and bad actors alike, but I think that little analogy at the end doesn't quite work in the way that you want it to. I'm not saying that there are some doctors who are evil to the patients, although that is certainly the case. What I'm saying is there are some patients for whom the doctor is the wrong kind. When it comes to issues of addiction, for example, for a patient who does not believe in gods, nor does not really have the capacity to, like, let's say, me, or my cousin, or my little brother, people like that who have suffered from addiction, that have gone into these programs, I don't think the doctors are the bad people. I don't think the people treating them are bad dudes doing bad things to them intentionally. I think they're the wrong doctors. This is the wrong doctor for this issue. That is the problem I'm getting at here.
But you got on and you were like, man, the trauma from my past. And you mentioned that your best friend had been kidnapped. You mentioned a long bout of homelessness, the whole feeling of feeling displaced, etc. You mentioned a miscarriage, the loss of a baby. My wife and I, our first child was a miscarriage. I understand. You also mentioned the polyamorous relationship that most men in America, would give their left leg for, I'm being humorous there, but they would want to be in something like that. And then you talk about how traumatic it all was. And so you really put your heart out there.
I just wanted to leave those parts in there because they kind of make me sound really cool. And that's a good summary of events. Spot on, my guy. If only I could have told the story that well.
And in a sense, you're kind of begging for help. But then you say, oh, it's not really begging for help. This isn't my vibe. This isn't my thing. But I want anybody that's struggling with the same kind of depression that I'm struggling with to know that they are loved. And I couldn't help but think, while you're mentioning that, I'm like, dude, you're so close. Like, you are so close. Because to say something like that is to admit that you don't have complete control over life.
I am very curious where you got the idea that I think life is something that can be controlled, because obviously it cannot. From our perspective, from our very limited perspective of the universe, it seems entirely random to us. And I guess that gives these sorts of masters of the universe types of personalities, like, say, Elon Musk, the perception that they have more power over their own destiny than they actually do. For someone like him, it must look accurate. I mean, the guy is the richest man on earth, but on the other hand, his children all hate him and he can't keep a woman, so not exactly keeping things under control there either. But this isn't about Elon Musk, this is about philosophy, and my philosophy is simply this. We live in a universe governed by laws. There are laws of the universe, and if we could see the pattern, we could tell everything that would ever happen in the universe's history. But as humans, we cannot do this. It looks random from our perspective, but it is not. Still, the idea that we have control over life, that's more of a Christian thing, isn't it? Because it's Christians, unless you're like a hardcore Calvinist, who tend to think that free will is something that is a gift given by God. I obviously don't believe in God, so I don't agree with that perspective.
Like, things have really spun out of control. You mentioned something about American arrogance, and you said that you would think that you could just go through these things and come out okay, and we really can't. And so out of all that, how is the help supposed to come? And so I think you're trying something along the lines, you didn't state this that I remember, but you're trying the confession part, like I'm confessing that I've got an issue.
Now, here he did make kind of an interesting point, because this whole confessional thing is a part of Christianity. I mean, it is a cultural thing for Christians to confess publicly Obviously, there's been any number of cases of that from any number of issues. Like, think about Ted Haggard. If you don't know who he is, give him a Google. You're in for quite the ride. But yeah, public confession is a pretty prominent thing in American culture, and I'm not sure if that's what I was doing per se. In this case, it's more like publicly reaching out and saying, I have this problem, and I'm trying to figure out how to deal with it. And if you have the same problems, maybe I can learn something from you. Maybe we can learn something from each other about how to deal with it, because we're all in this together. I mean, our species did not make it 300,000 years by not working together to solve our issues.
I'm confessing that anxiety and depression are overwhelming, and I want to reach out to others in this, and etc. And this is very much like Alcoholics Anonymous, where you get in and you confess, but then you look for your higher power, and there is something good, very good in confession, and anybody that's ever been to an Alcoholics Anonymous meeting knows this. There's something very good about confession, and it probably felt really good to get some of this off your chest so that you're not alone.
Jethro, my friend, I know we are both Americans, and at this point that's a little bit misleading because from my time in the UK, I've learned one very interesting thing about this country. Instead of Alcoholics Anonymous and the higher power thing, most groups here are secular because this country is a lot less religious than the United States is. I mean, obviously the Muslims are still super religious, but for the most part, the UK is a pretty secular country, at least in thinking terms. They still have a state religion, and you're still taught about it in schools, apparently. But things are a little bit different here. I think the confession here takes a very different form than it does in America with like AA and stuff, because like most groups, most popular groups in America, like AA, they do have the higher power thing. It's not as common elsewhere. I just want to be clear about that.
But all of that is not enough. And that's one of the reasons why Alcoholics Anonymous, push towards, finding your higher power. You should know that, like, Ann Hersey Elise, who just used to run around with Richard Dawkins. Yeah, you know who Richard Dawkins is. She has just confessed Jesus Christ as Lord and Savior. And I know your response to that, and I pray that you'll just give the whole video a chance and just listen for a second.
Well, obviously I've commented, as you pointed out, on the whole Ayan Hirsi Ali thing, and frankly, I never had a high opinion of her. I always thought she was something of a charlatan because she was a refugee from a poor country, a Muslim country, and became an atheist after reading about feminism and such, and then became a far-right anti-immigration, anti-refugee politician, super socially conservative. So not a lot really changed in her thinking about the world, aside from no longer believing in Allah and that sort of thing, for a while. But I always found her to be a very suspicious person, and I was actually kind of shocked how many people didn't pick up on that until it was too late. Dawkins did kind of like an open response to her, and he pointed out something very good in his open response, which was the message she posted didn't really have a lot to say about the truth claims of Christianity. It was all about cultural issues like defending the West from Russia and from Muslims and from immigrants and refugees and the LGBT and that sort of thing. Very much like Christian concerns, but concerns she's had even while she was an atheist. So I don't find her story to be that interesting. Now, there are stories that are probably pretty compelling, but I think hers is among the least compelling I've ever heard in my whole life.
But she is saying, oh, I got to a point where I needed Christ.
The one thing she did mention in that first message, I believe, aside from the cultural stuff, was she felt this crisis of meaning that we hear so much about, that now there is a lack of meaning in the world, but I don't think it's going to be solved by people just converting to Christianity, and I think Nietzsche pointed this out fairly well. If you've never read Nietzsche, I'd suggest you do, Jethro, because whether you're religious or not, there's a whole lot you can learn from Nietzsche about humanity and its destiny. By the time Nietzsche lived and died, he was convinced that God was dead and we had killed him, that people were merely feasting upon the corpse of God and no longer actually believed in that God. And I think for me personally, Ayan Hirsi Ali is a very specific example of exactly what he was talking about. She doesn't have a real belief in God, in Jehovah, Yahweh, whatever you want to call him, in the resurrection of Jesus. She is using the corpse of God to her ends. Now, when I say God is dead, I'm obviously being metaphorical, figurative. I'm not being literal. There was not a God that we struck down together in all of our might. But that would be cool. The Klingons did that in Star Trek. What I'm saying is simply that God used to be a respectable idea that everybody could believe in, but over time, that belief has sort of given way. Like, you can't seriously believe it for most people anymore. It's just kind of like a cultural thing for most people who are claiming to be Christian. And Ion Hirsi Ali is no different than that. And I think, read Nietzsche, read The Antichrist, read a bunch of Nietzsche. He's actually great. I'm not saying it's going to change how you think about everything, but I'm sure you'll at least see some different perspectives if you haven't read it yet, which I don't imagine you have.
That's what atheism is shutting God so far out of the equation that there's a vacuum, and you're like, man, something's got to fill this equation. Something's got to happen here.
This is the point where I'm not sure if we're supposed to be talking about me or Aeon Hirsi Ali still, because it doesn't sound like me or anything I said. Jethro here is referring to a concept called the God-shaped hole, this idea that everybody has a God-shaped hole in their heart that only Yahweh can fill. That's the idea here. I've heard this all my life. They'll say, you can't feel it with drugs, you can't feel it with sex, you can't feel it with alcohol, you can't feel it with money, it's only going to be filled by the blood of Jesus. Heard it all my life, and frankly, I don't feel like there's any kind of hole in me. I feel like a complete person, which I know must be shocking news to the Christians out there, but I don't feel like there's anything really missing per se. Now, as I said in my video, what got me into a state of alcoholism, as opposed to simply being a drinker every now and then, is I like having fun. I am a fun person, believe it or not. I go to a lot of punk shows, a lot of metal shows. I go out as often as I can. I just like doing things. And when you like doing things that much, punk especially, alcohol becomes part of it. And eventually you find that you didn't stop drinking. You just kept drinking. You started drinking one day at a punk show or something, and then it's been 7 days and you're still drunk, and you're like, huh, how did that happen? To me, that's not really indicative of a God-shaped hole in my heart. That's more indicative of I like to have fun. And when you're having fun with addictive substances that feel good, sometimes those things go a little bit too far.
And yeah, I think it noteworthy also that France, which is known as being a deeply atheistic country, very anti-God and in parts of the country and in people of the country, but they're going through a revival of sorts right now where people are coming to Christ at a rapid rate.
Okay, multiple citations needed. I mean, first of all, the idea that France is an atheist country is kind of odd. I'm pretty sure they're over half Catholic. Are there a lot of atheists in France? Yes. Does the French social system discourage religion in public settings? Yes. Does that mean that France is an atheist country? Well, no. France is a secular country. They just have a much harder form of secularism than America does. Now, as for the issue of revival in France, what are we counting as revival exactly? I mean, revival is very much a Protestant sort of term, it seems like. You don't really get Catholics talking about having revivals so much. So for an overwhelmingly Catholic country like France, it's a very, I'm sure, now granted, I'm sure Catholics use the term revival. They just probably use it in a very different way than Protestants do. And Jethro is a Protestant, as far as I'm aware. So, what do you mean by revival? Could I get some numbers on this revival? I think another thing to point out is, I like to point this out with America a lot, but they'll trumpet these revivals happening in America sometimes, like at random schools or whatever. There was one school where about 70,000 people attended over a few-week period. And the thing is, the difficult thing for Christians is going to be this. Something like 30% of Americans call themselves non-religious at this point. That's a very big number. That's about 90 million Americans who call themselves non-religious. I hope my math is correct there. Please correct me if it's not. About 90 million, 100 million Americans who are non-religious. It's a pretty big number. So you could have a revival of 100,000 people a day, every single day, for years on end, and really not make much of a dent in that number at all. France is a smaller country, and I would like to know the numbers on their revivals, but I haven't really heard anything about revivals in France, and besides that, it doesn't really matter to me whether there's a revival in France or not. It doesn't matter to me whether there's a revival in the most atheist country on earth. Truth is not determined by numbers.
You mentioned that, anxiety and depression, and you need the right therapy, and you need to know this, and I believe you're a fact guy, so I'm going to share some of this, but you know how many therapies there are? There's a ton of therapies, there's a ton of different therapies, and they change them all the time because they don't quite work.
So here we have a pretty big disagreement. Saying that it doesn't work merely because it's changing all the time is like saying science doesn't work because science is changing all the time. These things are based in evidence, and things based in evidence change according to the evidence. Now, in countries like America, where there has been an enormous rise in the rates of mental illness and despair and depression and all this stuff across groups, you're going to have to find new ways to deal with these problems because people are so different. There's so many different ways a person can think about the world and themselves. There's so many different ways brain chemistry works. That's why there's so many drugs. And I can confirm that for me personally, therapy has been a huge benefit. The only time it's really gone wrong is when I had a good therapist who quit. And usually that was because they were old and going on old techniques that actually worked for me, but they were old, and the newer techniques don't always work. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. I have been in therapy before. Just because I can't afford it at this point in my life doesn't mean I wasn't able to in the past. But it has worked, and it's worked really well for me. And so have medications. SSRIs work great on me, and they always have. I was on SSRIs in college, and they changed my life in a really fantastic way. I'm not sure I would be here without them, so to say that because the industry changes a lot, it's not valid is just kind of silly. I mean, you could say the same thing about Christianity. Look at all the reformations Christianity has undergone over the past 2,000 years. I guarantee you this much. If you, Jethro Bodine, were to be transported back to, let's say, 100, 200 AD, you would find Christianity almost totally unrecognizable. Some things you would still find recognizable, but a lot of it you would just be like, What is this? What am I seeing? So something changing a lot doesn't make it wrong. That means it's adjusting to changing conditions in the world and other people.
Psychologists, when you survey them and dig in deep, you find out that the number one problem they are dealing with across the board is guilt. It's like, even if they tell people you have an evolutionary background, you're just an animal, there really is no right and wrong, they still somehow or another can't get rid of guilt. And then the play is, well, it must be culturally conditioned. Well, maybe there's some cultural conditioning to it, but maybe there's some reality to it.
I don't see how guilt points to God here, because it does seem like a very positive evolutionary trait to have in a social species like humanity. And yes, it's pretty obvious that just telling people, oh, don't worry, it's an evolved trait, that's not going to make guilt go away. If it's an evolved trait, it's still there. And it does seem like the kind of trait, there's a whole branch called evolutionary psychology, and the whole point of evolutionary psychology is to figure out why humans are the way we are. Some things are without a doubt cultural conditioning, but other things are probably built in, and I would say guilt is one of them for most people, but there are people who don't experience guilt. We call these people sociopaths, psychopaths. Think of serial killers. They don't have much guilt, do they? In fact, they seem to like what they do quite a lot. But if that were the norm, we would not be a very successful species on the whole, which is why it's useful to have traits like guilt bred into us.
We can't get rid of guilt because it is a real factor. And so you mentioned that there was a lot of trauma in the history, and I agree. There's definitely a lot of trauma. But I want to push you to take another step. And this part, you might get angry. You might just might be upset about this. But this is the part that we've all got to be confronted with, is like, what portion of that did I take part in?
Well, this video is getting really long, and we're getting into the Jesus-y stuff now, and I've obviously responded to all of that 1,000 times, so I'm just going to skip all of that. I don't blame Jethro for saying all the Jesus-y things that he does say after this point, because there's no way he could have seen all 200 plus of my videos and worked out my entire life's philosophy and the fact that I've dealt with these arguments over and over and over. So we're going to wrap it up, thankfully. But before we do, I just want to talk about that last thing he said there. First of all, I'm not entirely sure why I should be angry. He said I might get angry at the things that he just said, but I'm not sure, why. Maybe it's because I'm not a naturally, angry person. Nothing really presses me all that much when it comes to, the subject of anger. And yes, you have to think about your own role in reference to the things you've been through, because there were times during homelessness where I could have taken an option to no longer be homelessness, but I thought the option itself was worse than the homelessness, so I'd rather just be homeless. And I know that's a crazy thought to people who have never experienced it, but I'm sure if you've been homeless, you may understand that perspective. Now, when it comes to regrets, what do I regret in my life? You might think I regret all of the movements that led me into all of that trauma, those years and years of trauma, because it was a long time, and alcoholism was the result. You might think there's a lot of regret there. But actually, there's the opposite. There's a lot of acceptance, especially self-acceptance. I am who I am. I do what I do. I am the person that I am, for better or worse. So yes, I do look at my own culpability in the things that I have been through. Let's talk about the polyamory situation. Two incredibly gorgeous supermodel women who were artists, and I knew that situation was going to go terribly. I had no idea how terribly. The one thing I would change in my whole life, just one thing, I wouldn't change anything else. I would be better to one person in that situation for a period of about 2 weeks. That's it. That's the one thing. Now, thankfully, there was no physical abuse on my part, although they did physically abuse each other. I just said some things that I wish I hadn't said. And I think that to me kind of epitomizes my attitude, that really, despite going through all of it, there's not a lot to regret there, and there's just the one thing I wish I could change. But I think I can actually sum this all up with my life philosophy, and I will now give you my life philosophy through the words of a fictional character in a scene I like a lot.
A man would have to put his soul at hazard. He'd have to say, okay. I'll be part of this world.